The market street was once alive with music and voices, but now it was only dust and broken stalls. The alien widow walked slowly through the ruins, her cloak pulled tightly around her thin body, her eyes searched the ground for anything, crumbs, fruit skin, or even a bone thrown away by dogs. Her kind had been proud once, her people tall and beautiful, but after the war they were broken, scattered, and unwanted. She was alone, no mate to protect her, no tribe to share her hunger, and her stomach growled so loudly she pressed her hand against it in shame. The humans who lived in this settlement looked at her with suspicion whenever she passed. They had lost much too, and to them, she was a reminder of battles and blood. She knew their stares, their whispers, and their fear, so she tried to walk silently, keeping her head down. Still, she could not stop her eyes from drifting to the small wooden tables where food was being served. The smell of bread, warm and soft, floated in the air, mixed with the simple stew boiling in an iron pot. Her throat tightened, her lips parted, and she swallowed painfully. For 2 days she had not eaten. Her body felt weak, her hands trembling under the cloak, but more painful than hunger was her pride. She had once been the wife of a warrior, a man strong and respected, and now she was reduced to begging with her eyes. No, she told herself, she would not ask. She would rather starve than lower herself before humans. She turned away, but her legs felt heavy. Her steps slow, her vision blurred for a moment, and she leaned against the broken wall of a stall. Children laughed in the distance, their voices bright like sunlight in the gray street. She looked up and saw a little human girl running with a small piece of bread in her hand, her hair bouncing, her face glowing with joy. The widow felt a tear slide down her cheek, not from sadness alone, but from the memory of her own child, lost in the fire when the city fell. She quickly wiped the tear away and lowered her head, ashamed to show weakness in front of strangers. But the little girl had noticed her, and in that moment something strange happened. The girl stopped running, turned her head, and looked directly at the alien woman. Her eyes were wide and innocent, no fear, no hate, only curiosity. The widow froze, her heart racing, because she was used to humans pulling their children away whenever she came near. The girl's father was sitting at a table nearby, his hands rough and strong, his clothes simple from hard labor. He was eating slowly, saving more for his daughter than for himself. The alien widow could see the steam rising from their meal, and her body ached to taste even one bite. She forced herself to step back, to leave before shame drowned her completely. But then the little girl whispered something to her father, her voice small but filled with a boldness that pierced the silence. The father looked shocked, his spoon halfway to his lips, and the widow could not hear what was said, but the father's eyes turned toward her, wide and confused. The widow felt her chest tighten, fear gripping her, thinking maybe the girl had called her a monster. She turned quickly to leave, but her steps faltered, her weakness making her stumble. The sound of her stomach growling echoed in the quiet street, a cruel reminder that she could no longer hide her hunger. For the first time in years, she wished her mate was still alive. He would have hunted for her, protected her, and never allowed her to suffer like this. But he was gone, and she was nothing but a starving widow, forgotten by her own kind and rejected by humans. Her knees shook, and she leaned against the wall again, closing her eyes. The smell of the human meal wrapped around her like a chain, drawing her closer even as her pride screamed for her to walk away. When she opened her eyes, the little girl was still watching her. The child's face was soft, almost glowing with kindness, and her small hands clutched the bread tightly. The alien widow wanted to run, to escape before she broke completely, but she could not move. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as an enemy, not as a burden, but as someone who was hurting. And deep inside, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Though she tried to smother it quickly, the widow whispered to herself in her own language, a prayer for strength. Her voice was weak, almost lost in the air. She prayed not for food, but for the courage to keep standing. Yet, she knew in her heart that one more day without help would end her. And though she did not know it yet, the child's bold words, the ones that made her father freeze, were about to change her life forever. The little human girl tugged at her father's sleeve, her small eyes never leaving the alien widow. Her lips moved with quiet words, but in the silence of the ruined marketplace, the widow thought she could almost hear them. The father froze, his spoon held mid-air, his face turning pale as if the words shocked him deeply. The widow blinked, confused, her heart racing, unsure if the child had insulted her or whispered a curse, but then the father leaned down, his voice low, and asked his daughter to repeat what she had just said. The girl stood straighter, her voice no longer soft, and spoke loud enough for both her father and the widow to hear. "Marry my dad, and you will never be hungry again," she said, her innocent face glowing with certainty. The marketplace seemed to stop breathing, people turning their heads, their conversations cut short. The widow's eyes widened, and she felt her entire body stiffen under the heavy cloak. For a moment, she thought she had misheard, that her hunger had twisted her ears into lies, but the girl had spoken clearly, her small hands clutching the crust of bread, her eyes full of kindness and boldness beyond her years. The father's mouth fell open, and he quickly put his hand over his daughter's lips. "Child, do not speak such things," he whispered sharply, embarrassment coloring his cheeks red, but it was too late. The words had flown into the air like a spark into dry grass. The alien widow trembled, shame, sorrow, and disbelief crashing into her heart all at once. She wanted to shout, to tell the child not to mock her, not to play cruel games with a starving woman, but when she looked into the little girl's eyes, she saw no mockery, no trick, only honesty. That purity struck her harder than hunger, harder than pride, and her lips trembled as she tried to form words but could not. The humans around them whispered now, voices carrying through the ruined street. "Did she just say Mary?" one man muttered. "A child offering her father to an alien," another whispered in disbelief. The father stood quickly, his chair scraping against the ground, his face caught between anger and confusion. "I am sorry," he said toward the widow, his voice shaking. "My daughter does not understand the weight of her words." The widow lowered her head, hiding her expression in shadow, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Part of her wanted to run, to disappear into the broken alleys, to bury her shame where no one could find it, but her weak body betrayed her again. Her legs too heavy, her chest too tight, her hunger chaining her in place. The father bent down to scold his daughter, but the child pushed his hand away stubbornly. "I mean it, father," she said, her voice louder this time. "She is hungry, she is alone, and we are alone too. Why can't she be with us?" The widow gasped, her eyes snapping up at the boldness of the little girl. Her people had ejected her, the humans had feared her, yet this child spoke of her as if she already belonged. Her heart twisted painfully, torn between longing and fear, between wanting to believe and knowing she should not. The father's face hardened, his jaw set, and he hissed under his breath, "Enough, child, do not speak further." But the girl only turned her head and looked at the widow again, her eyes steady. The alien widow felt her throat tighten, tears burning her eyes though she tried to hold them back. She whispered to herself, "Why speak such things to me?" Though the child could not hear her, her pride screamed that she should leave, but her empty stomach and aching soul kept her rooted to the ground. The father finally sighed, defeated by his daughter's stubbornness, and he turned toward the widow. "I am sorry," he said again, his voice softer this time. "She does not understand." But the girl interrupted him, stepping closer to the widow. Her small hand reached out, holding the piece of bread, shaking slightly but steady in purpose. "Please take it," the child said. "Please eat. You look like my mom did when she was sick. I don't want you to disappear." The widow's heart cracked open at those words. For years she had carried the memory of her lost mate, her lost child, the night of fire and smoke. No one had spoken to her with such raw kindness since that day. She lifted her trembling hand from her cloak, slowly, painfully, as if lifting a stone. Her fingers brushed against the bread, rough against her soft alien skin, and she hesitated, her pride screaming. But the girl smiled, a smile bright and full of trust, and pressed the bread into her hand. The widow's body gave in, and she pulled the bread close, her lips quivering as she raised it to her mouth. The first bite was small, but it sent warmth flooding through her. The taste of simple bread felt richer than any feast she had ever known. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she chewed, each swallow breaking another wall of pride inside her. The father watched silently, his eyes filled with conflict. He did not want to shame the woman, but he could not ignore his daughter's heart. The people around still whispered, still judged, but the widow no longer cared. Her hunger was easing, and for the first time in years, she felt something else too, the faint, fragile spark of belonging, a feeling she thought she had lost forever. As she finished the small piece of bread, she looked at the child again. The girl's bold words still echoed in her mind, words she did not yet believe, but words she would never forget. Marry my dad, and you will never be hungry again. The widow closed her eyes, pressing the bread crumbs against her lips. She did not know it yet, but those innocent words had already started to weave a new thread of fate, one she could no longer escape. The father sat back down slowly, his mind spinning. His daughter's bold words still echoed in his ears, heavy like stones he could not shake away. Marry my dad, and you will never be hungry again. He could not believe she had said it, and worse, she had meant it. He looked at his little girl, her bright eyes filled with determination, and then at the alien widow, who clutched the piece of bread like it was treasure. Shame burned in his chest, shame that he could not give his daughter more than a small meal. He was a worker, nothing more, a man who spent his days lifting crates, fixing tools, doing whatever jobs the settlement needed. He had no riches, no land, only a small home and the love of his child. And now, in front of the entire marketplace, his daughter had tied his life to a starving alien widow with a single bold sentence. The father wanted to be angry, but when he saw the widow's trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, his anger softened into guilt. The alien woman had tried to turn away, tried to hide her hunger, but her body betrayed her. He had heard her stomach growl, loud and painful, a sound he knew too well from nights when even he and his daughter had gone to bed hungry. Her face was pale, her lips dry, her steps unsteady. She looked less like an enemy and more like a shadow of someone who had once been proud. And something inside him stirred, something he did not want to admit: pity, and even worse, responsibility. The widow sat near the wall, her cloak wrapped tightly around her as if it could protect her from the stairs. She held the bread close, eating slowly, each bite almost a prayer. The father watched her, torn between his pride and his compassion. He wanted to stand and walk away, pretend none of this had happened, but he could not, because his daughter's small hand rested on his arm, holding him in place. She is alone, father, the girl whispered. She has no one, just like us. The word struck him deeply, cutting through the armor of his doubt. Since his wife's death, he had done everything to raise his daughter alone. He had seen the same lonely nights, the same empty table, the same silent tears. Now his daughter saw that same pain in the alien widow, and she was right. He could not deny it. The father let out a long sigh and rubbed his rough hands across his face. The people in the market were still watching, their whispers like tiny daggers cutting his skin. Some looked disgusted, others curious, a few even sympathetic, but he knew that if he made a choice here, it would not only affect him, it would affect his daughter. And yet, when he looked at her smiling face, at the way she held her head high without fear, he felt his heart soften. Again, he leaned toward the widow, his voice careful and quiet. You should eat, he said, his tone almost gentle. There is more if you need. The widow lifted her head, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she seemed ready to refuse, to protect the last piece of pride she still carried, but her lips trembled, and with a weak nod, she whispered a single word: please. The Father called for another bowl of stew, though it meant less for him. He set it before her, the steam rising into the cold air. The widow's hands shook as she reached for it, as if she feared it might be taken away. She took a sip, and warmth spread through her thin frame, her shoulders relaxing, her eyes closing for a brief moment as if she could finally breathe. The father watched her, and though part of him still resisted, another part felt something he had not felt in years: peace. As she ate, the widow's mind drifted back into memories. Her mate, strong and proud, had always brought her food, always protected her from shame. She remembered his laugh, his voice, the night he promised her that even in war, they would always have each other. But that promise had been broken in fire and blood, and she had been left to starve alone. Now, with humans, her people's former enemies, she found herself tasting life again. The father leaned back, his thoughts heavy. Could he really allow this? Bring an alien widow into his life, into his home, around his child? It was madness, he told himself, dangerous and foolish. But then he saw his daughter's hand reaching for the widow's cloak, gently tugging, as if inviting her closer. The widow looked down at the child with wide eyes, and instead of fear, she smiled, a small fragile smile that carried years of pain and hope. The father's chest ached, his doubts and fears battling with his heart. He knew the settlement would not accept this easily. They would question him, maybe even turn against him, but he also knew that he could not turn away from someone in such need, not when his daughter, with her pure heart, had already accepted the widow without hesitation. He realized then that the bold words of a child had forced him to see what his own eyes had ignored. The alien widow, trembling and broken, was not an enemy, not a burden, but someone searching for the same thing they were, family. And as he watched her finish the last bite of stew, her tears falling silently, he understood something. One meal had not only fed her hunger, it had planted a seed in all of them, a seed of something fragile but powerful, connection. And though he did not say it aloud, he knew the truth. His life had already begun to change. The stew warmed her body, but it also awakened something far deeper than hunger. As the alien widow held the wooden bowl in her hands, her mind began to drift, pulled back into memories she had tried so hard to bury. The sound of laughter once filled her home, the deep voice of her mate echoing against the stone walls of their dwelling. He had been strong, tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the burdens of war, and he had carried her heart with the same strength. She remembered the way he looked at her, as if she was the only light in the dark, and for years she believed no force in the galaxy could take that away. But war had no mercy. The night the flames reached their city, she had clutched her child close while her mate fought in the streets. She could still see the sky painted red, the ground shaking with the thunder of weapons, the screams of neighbors filling the air. Her mate had turned once, shouting for her to run, his eyes blazing with determination. She had obeyed, clutching her little one to her chest, running through smoke and fire. But in that single night everything ended. Her child slipped from her grasp when an explosion ripped the street apart. She remembered the sound of her child's cry, the desperate stretch of her hands, and then only silence. She searched through rubble, screamed until her throat broke, but all she found was ashes and the lifeless stillness of a world destroyed. Her mate never returned from the battle, his body never found, only whispers that he had fought until the very last breath. Alone and broken, she wandered through wastelands, her heart a hollow echo of what it had once been. Now, sitting on a human bench with a simple bowl of stew, the past returned like a flood, her tears mixed with the steam rising from the bowl, her hands trembling as if holding the ghost of her child instead of food. The human girl's bright eyes, the softness of her voice, they stirred wounds she thought had turned to stone. The way the child called her mom, without hesitation, tore her soul apart, because for years she had dreamed of hearing that word again. She wanted to push it away, to bury the feelings deep, but they rose stronger than ever. The widow closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. She prayed for her mate, for her child, for forgiveness for surviving when they had not. Her people had whispered behind her back, accusing her of cowardice for living when others had fallen. She carried that shame like a chain, believing she was cursed, unworthy of love, unworthy of family. But as the human child leaned against her cloak, unafraid, the chain began to weaken. The father watched her silently, his eyes filled with questions he did not voice. He could see the way her tears fell, not only from hunger but from grief too heavy for words. He wondered what memories haunted her, what pain she carried that made her shoulders bow so low. Though he tried to stay distant, he felt himself pulled into her sorrow, because he too knew what it meant to lose. His wife's passing had left an emptiness he could not fill, and seeing the widow's pain mirrored his own. The marketplace around them faded, the whispers growing dim. For a brief moment, it was only the three of them, the father, his daughter, and the widow, locked in her memories. The little girl reached out again, small fingers brushing against the widow's sleeve. That touch, so light and pure, broke the dam inside her heart. The widow let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hand, ashamed of her weakness yet unable to hold it back. The child did not pull away, she only pressed closer. "You don't have to be alone," she whispered, her innocent voice cutting through years of silence. The widow's chest shook as she tried to steady her breathing. She wanted to believe those words, but fear clung to her, the fear of losing again, the fear of opening her heart only to watch it shatter. Her memories had taught her that love came with loss, and loss was unbearable. Yet something about the humans felt different. They had no reason to show her kindness, no reason to share their food or their home. Still, they did, without demand, without chains, without cruelty. The widow's mind struggled to understand it, but her heart already knew. This was not pity, this was the fragile beginning of acceptance, and acceptance was something she had not felt since the war stole her world. The father cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "You carry heavy pain," he said quietly, his voice gentle but steady. "I do not know your story, but I see it in your eyes." The widow looked at him, startled by his words, because no one had ever dared to speak of her sorrow so openly. She wanted to answer, to explain, but her voice failed her. All she could do was nod, her tears telling the story her lips could not. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows grew long, the widow followed the father and child to their small home. Her steps were hesitant, her heart torn between fear and longing. The memory of her mate's last words haunted her, but the warmth of the little girl's hand in hers gave her strength. As she entered the small, humble house, she realized that memories did not have to be chains. Sometimes they could be bridges, carrying her from the ruins of the past to the fragile hope of a new tomorrow. The next morning, whispers spread through the village like smoke. Some said the human father had brought an alien widow into his home, others claimed the child had called her mother in the marketplace. By midday, the story had reached every corner of the settlement, and people gathered in small groups, their voices sharp and restless. The widow felt the stares the moment she stepped outside with the little girl, their eyes heavy with judgment. She pulled her cloak tighter, her head lowered, but she could not hide from the rumors. At the well, two women whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "Humans died fighting them, and now we share bread with one," said one, her eyes cold. "She'll bring misfortune," another added. "Aliens are cursed, they take but never give." The widow's hands clenched around the bucket, her heart aching as the words stabbed deep. She wanted to defend herself, but the weight of shame kept her silent. The father arrived moments later, his presence tall and firm. He carried tools on his shoulder, the mark of a worker who labored honestly each day. When he saw the women glaring, he did not falter. Instead, he stood beside the widow and took the bucket from her hands. "She is under my roof," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the whispers, "and anyone under my roof will not be shamed." The women looked away, muttering, but their distrust lingered in their eyes. Later, at the fields, the men spoke with sharper tongues. One spat on the ground, saying, "You risk all of us by keeping her. What if she betrays you?" Another shook his head. "She is their kind, the same kind that burned our homes. Do not forget the war." The father tightened his grip on his tools, his jaw hard, but before he could answer, his daughter ran forward. She stood in front of the widow, her small arms spread wide, and shouted, "She saved me yesterday, she is not our enemy." The men paused, their eyes falling on the child, their voices caught in their throats. The widow's eyes filled with tears, because the child had spoken the truth. When she nearly stumbled into danger at the edge of the ruins, it had been the widow's hand that pulled her back. Still, the whispers did not stop, they only grew. By evening, the village was divided, half believing the widow could be trusted, half certain she was a threat. The widow felt the weight of every glance, every hushed voice, and guilt began to settle in her chest like a stone. That night, as she sat by the fire in the father's home, her voice shook. "I should not stay," she whispered, her eyes on the flames. "I bring trouble to you and your child. The people will turn against you." The father looked at her, his face tired but steady. "You are not the trouble," he replied. "Fear is the trouble, and fear is always loud." The little girl leaned against the widow's side, her small voice stubborn as always. "Don't go, you belong here." The widow's heart broke again at those words, but this time in a different way. She had been called many names since the war, cursed, unwanted, dangerous, but never had she been told she belonged. The firelight danced on her tear-streaked face as she tried to believe the child's words. Still, the village's anger grew, whispers turning into arguments. By the next morning, a small crowd gathered outside the father's home, demanding answers. "You put us all in danger," a man shouted. "She has no place among us. Send her away before it's too late," a woman cried, clutching her child close. The widow stood in the doorway, trembling, her cloak wrapped around her like armor. She wanted to step outside and surrender, to ease the burden she had caused this family, but the little girl ran forward again, her voice breaking through the angry crowd. "She is my mom now," the child shouted, her cheeks red but her eyes bright with fire. The crowd fell into silence, shocked by the boldness of such small words. The widow gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, tears spilling down her face. The father placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. His voice rang out, calm but firm, "My child has spoken, and I will not go against her heart." The villagers looked at each other, unsure, their anger softening into confusion. They saw the child standing bravely in front of the alien widow, protecting her as if she were blood. Some shook their heads and walked away, muttering, but others lingered, their faces troubled yet thoughtful. The widow stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding as if it might burst. For the first time since the war, someone had stood for her, not out of pity, but out of choice. That night, as the stars filled the dark sky, the widow lay awake. The words of the villagers haunted her, but so did the words of the child. You belong here. She thought of her mate, of her child lost in the flames, and for the first time, the memory did not only bring pain, it also brought strength, because she realized that maybe, just maybe, life was offering her another chance. And though the road ahead was filled with struggle, she knew she could not turn away now. The days that followed were uneasy. The widow stayed inside most of the time, helping with simple chores, mending clothes, sweeping floors, and tending the fire. The little girl followed her everywhere, asking questions, laughing, and filling the house with a warmth the widow had not felt in years. But outside those walls, the village still whispered, their distrust sharp as knives. The father kept his head high, but even he could feel the weight of the stairs each time he walked through the square. Then one night, the test came, not from whispers but from steel. A group of bandits descended on the settlement under the cover of darkness, their torches blazing, their voices shouting. They came for food, tools, and anything they could carry. The village, unprepared, erupted into chaos, children crying, women screaming, men rushing to grab whatever weapons they could. The father grabbed a rusted blade, pulling his daughter close, but before he could move, the door burst open with the sound of boots pounding the earth. The widow stood in the shadows of the room, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Her kind had once been feared warriors, and though hunger and grief had weakened her body, the instincts of her people still lived inside her. When she saw the bandits dragging a villager outside, her blood surged. Her cloak fell from her shoulders, revealing the markings of her alien heritage, scars of battles past. The father looked at her in shock, torn between fear and hope, but before he could speak, she was already moving. The bandits did not expect resistance, but when the widow stepped into the street, their laughter died. She picked up a broken staff from the ground, her stance steady despite her thin frame. The first bandit lunged at her with a knife, but she twisted, her staff striking his arm with a crack that sent the blade clattering. The villagers gasped as the alien widow fought like a storm, each strike precise, each movement fierce. Her body shook with exhaustion, yet she pressed on, fueled not by strength alone but by something stronger, protection. In the chaos, the little girl stumbled, nearly caught by one of the raiders. The widow's heart stopped, and with a cry that echoed through the night, she threw herself forward. The staff struck hard, sending the bandit sprawling, but not before his blade grazed her side. Blood darkened her cloak, pain seared her body, yet she did not falter. She gathered the child into her arms, shielding her with her own body, her teeth clenched against the agony. The father rushed forward, cutting down another bandit with a desperate swing. When he saw the widow wounded, his chest filled with fear and rage. Stay back, he shouted, but the widow shook her head, her voice fierce despite her pain. No, I will not leave her, she said, her arms wrapped tightly around the child. In that moment, the villagers saw something they had never imagined, an alien risking her life, not for her own kind, but for a human child. The fight dragged on, but the villagers, inspired by the widow's courage, rallied. Together they pushed the bandits back, their shouts echoing into the night until the raiders fled into the darkness. The settlement lay in ruins, fires smoldering, but the people had survived, and at the center of it all stood the widow, blood on her side, her arms still holding the little girl safe. The crowd stared in silence, their fear of her replaced by something new, respect. The healer rushed forward, pressing cloth to the widow's wound. You are lucky, the healer murmured. The blade was shallow, though it could have been worse. The widow winced but did not release the child, who clung to her as if letting go would break the world. The father knelt beside them, his eyes full of gratitude and something deeper. You saved her, he whispered, his voice thick. You saved what I could not. The widow's eyes softened, her tears mixing with sweat and blood. I could not lose another child, she whispered back, her voice shaking. The father reached out, his rough hand brushing against her arm, steadying her as she trembled. For a moment, they looked at each other, two souls broken by loss, now bound by the same small life between them. The villagers watched, and whispers rose again, but this time they were not filled with hatred. She fought for us. One man said quietly, she bled for us. Another added, the fear that had gripped them for days began to loosen. They saw not a cursed alien, but a protector, someone who had risked everything for their survival. The child pulled back slightly, looking at the villagers with fire in her eyes. She is not a stranger, she shouted. She is family. The words rang through the night, silencing even the most doubtful voices. The widow, too weak to stand, held the child close, her heart aching with both pain and hope. For years she had lived in shadows, cast aside, starving, forgotten, but now, bleeding under the same stars that had once watched her fall, she felt something she thought she would never feel again. Trust. The test had come, and though it left her scarred, it also gave her a place. As dawn broke over the battered settlement, the widow lay resting inside the father's home, the little girl curled beside her, refusing to leave her side. The father sat nearby, sharpening his blade, his eyes drifting often to the woman who had saved his world. The village outside was quiet, but its heart had shifted. The alien widow was no longer just a burden, she was one of them, and her place among humans had been earned in blood and courage. The bandits were gone, their shadows swallowed by the hills. The village bore scars of the fight, broken fences, scorched roofs, blood on the earth. But there was also silence, the kind that comes only after survival. Inside the small home, the widow lay on a simple bed of straw, her wound bandaged, her body weak but her spirit restless. The little girl slept curled against her side, her small hand gripping the widow's cloak as if she feared letting go. The father sat nearby, his rough hand steadying a blade, but his eyes were not on the steel, they were on the woman who had saved his child. For hours he said nothing, but his silence was heavy with thought. He replayed the night again and again, the moment the widow had stepped into the firelight, the way she fought with fury, the way she shielded his daughter with her own blood. He had never seen such courage, not even in men he had called brothers in war. When the little girl stirred in her sleep and mumbled, "Mom," the father felt something inside him break open, something he had kept locked away since his wife's passing. He realized that the bold words of his child had not been foolish after all, they had been prophecy. The widow opened her eyes slowly, her body aching. When she saw the little girl beside her, safe and warm, a deep relief washed through her. Then her gaze shifted to the father, and for the first time she did not look away. Her eyes still held sorrow, but there was also light, fragile, hesitant, but real. "You should have let me go," she whispered, her voice weak. "I bring danger wherever I stay." The father shook his head, his voice firm but gentle. "You brought us life, not danger," he said. "You saved her, and you saved this village." The widow's lips trembled, tears rising unbidden, because she had never been spoken to with such honor. Her people had cast her aside, humans had feared her, but here she was, being told she had value again. She pressed her hand against her wound, feeling the pain, yet in that pain there was meaning. The little girl woke, blinking sleep from her eyes. When she saw the widow awake, she climbed onto her chest and smiled. "You stayed," she whispered softly. "I knew you would." The widow's arms wrapped around the child, her heart swelling with a love she thought she had buried with her own family. A single tear slid down her cheek, but this time it was not from grief, it was from the fragile joy of being needed. News of the widow's bravery spread through the village like fire on dry grass. Where once people had whispered curses, now they spoke with awe. "She fought like one of us," they said. "She bled for our children." When she stepped outside days later, leaning on a staff, the villagers did not turn away. Instead, they nodded, some even bowing their heads in respect. Still, not everyone was ready to accept her fully. Some watched with guarded eyes, their distrust not yet gone. But the father stood tall at her side, his daughter holding her hand. He spoke with a steady voice. "She is part of this house, part of this family, and no one will cast her out." The villagers listened, and though doubts lingered, they could no longer deny the truth of his words. That night, the three of them shared a meal at the small wooden table. The father set bread and stew before them, not much, but enough. The widow ate slowly, each bite filled with the warmth of belonging. The child laughed, telling stories, her voice filling the quiet corners of the house, and for the first time in years, the widow did not feel like a shadow, she felt like a mother. Again later, under the pale light of the moon, the widow stood outside, gazing at the stars. She thought of her mate, her child, the family she had lost, her heart ached, but it no longer felt empty. She whispered into the night, "Forgive me, I could not save you, but I will not waste the life I have been given." As she spoke, the father stepped beside her, his presence strong but gentle. "Lou, you don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised, and saw no pity in his eyes, only understanding. He, too, had lost, he, too, had known emptiness, and now, they both had found something new, fragile, uncertain, but real. The widow lowered her head, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. The little girl called from inside, her voice bright and insistent, "Mom, Dad, come eat before it gets cold." The widow froze at the word, her heart pounding. She had not been called that in years, not since her world burned. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. Stepping back into the house, the father followed, his hand brushing lightly against hers as they walked. No vows were spoken, no promises made, but something greater than words had been formed, a bond born from hunger, from loss, from courage, and from one child's bold words. At the table, the three of them sat close, the firelight warming their faces, and in that moment, the widow knew that one simple meal had changed everything forever.